Picture the scene. September 1812. Napoleon Bonaparte. At that point, the de facto ruler of Europe, the man before whom Berlin, Vienna, Madrid, and Warsaw had all bowed, stands on a hill overlooking Moscow, waiting for a delegation with the keys to the city. That was how it had always worked. The defeated would arrive, bow, present the symbolic keys. Negotiations would begin, a graceful ritual of surrender, perfected through repetition. No one came. Napoleon waited an hour. Then 2, then 3. Before him lay the largest city in Russia, burning in several places, nearly empty, abandoned. No delegation, no keys, no formal capitulation, only ashes, looters, and, according to eyewitnesses, a remarkable number of abandoned cats. In their panic, Muscovites had taken their children, their silver, their icons. They had not had time for the cats. The man responsible for this surreal reception was, at that very moment, 40 miles from Moscow. He was sitting in the village of Tarutino drinking tea, dozing after lunch, and methodically waiting for the greatest army in European history to rot alive. His name was Mikhail Illarionovich Kutuzov, 70 years old, overweight, one-eyed, and perhaps the finest military mind of his generation, though he would have been the first to laugh at that description. Let's begin by clarifying who Napoleon Bonaparte actually was. For anyone who has been living in a bunker for the past 2 centuries, a Corsican, a genius, a reformer, a dictator. By 1812, he controlled, directly or through client states, roughly half of Europe. His army numbered around 450,000 men, superb equipment, the best generals, the most efficient logistics of the age. Before Russia, he had lost to no one. Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, Friedland. Each battle ended the same way. The enemy in ruins, Napoleon dictating the peace. Europe had grown accustomed to losing to him quickly, elegantly, and with minimal fuss. Russia cured him of that habit. More precisely, one elderly Russian general with phenomenal patience and absolutely no illusions about what war truly meant. Mikhail Kutuzov was born in 1745, meaning that by the time Napoleon entered the world, his future adversary would already be a seasoned officer with 20 years of service. That matters. While young Bonaparte was learning to read on Corsica, Kutuzov was already fighting, negotiating, maneuvering at court, accumulating experience the way a fine wine accumulates strength. Slowly, quietly, and then, all at once, powerfully. His biography was so improbable a Hollywood screenwriter would have rejected it. In 1774, near the Crimean town of Alushta, a musket ball passed through his left temple and exited near his right eye. Kutuzov survived. The surgeon's report amounted to something close to, "We have no idea how, but he is alive." He lost an eye and began wearing a patch, which gave him an appearance both piratical and imposing. In 1788, at Ochakov, another bullet followed nearly the same path. Again, it passed through. Again, he survived. Catherine the Great's court physician wrote words to the effect that Providence was preserving this man for something special. Hard to argue with that. Kutuzov was not merely a soldier. He belonged to that rare type who fought well, negotiated skillfully, and intrigued at court with equal talent. In 1793, Catherine sent him as ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. He spent a year in Constantinople, ingratiated himself with Sultan Selim III, and gathered such a volume of intelligence about the state of the Ottoman army, navy, and court politics that the Russian military establishment used it for the next 15 years. This was not a diplomatic tour of banquets. It was a professional intelligence operation carried out by a man who could appear to be a genial, heavy-set courtier while quietly memorizing everything. Kutuzov's central principle, running like a red thread through his entire career, was simple. War is won before it begins, by those who understand the enemy better, the terrain better, their own limitations better. A frontal assault is for those who have failed to think of anything smarter. Mikhail Illarionovich invariably thought of something smarter. Now to 1805 and his first direct clash with Napoleon. Here begins a story that explains much about Kutuzov's character. Austerlitz, December 2nd, 1805. The battle Napoleon himself guarded as his finest, and not without reason. The Russo-Austrian army numbered about 85,000 men. The French had fewer, around 73,000. On paper, the Allies held the advantage, but Kutuzov, who commanded the Allied forces, did not want this battle. Not at all. He saw the position, weak. He saw the French army, strong, experienced, with Napoleon personally in command, which in itself was a factor. He told Tsar Alexander I, "No, wait, stretch their lines of communication. Reinforcements will come. Winter will help." Alexander was 27. He wanted to be a commander. He wanted to defeat Napoleon personally in a splendid battle. In full uniform, the Austrian General Weyrother produced an elegant plan on paper, logical, optimistic, as plans always look before reality intervenes. Alexander said, "We attack." Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank. Bait. The Allies rushed toward it with full force. While they did so, the The French struck at the center, split the Allied army in two, and enveloped the left flank. It took hours, 36,000 Allied casualties against 9,000 French. Austria immediately sought peace at any terms. Prussia, which hours earlier had promised to join the coalition, quietly pretended it had made no such promise. Alexander reportedly wept beneath a tree at the edge of the field. Eyewitnesses described the scene with palpable discomfort. Kutuzov took a bullet to the cheek, his third head wound, and survived yet again, which begins to look like a private arrangement with fate. More importantly, he was promptly blamed for the disaster. It was unthinkable to blame the Tsar. Kutuzov received an honorable exile, appointed Governor General of Kiev, a convenient position for someone who needed to be removed from the capital without public dismissal. He went, said nothing, wrote no memoirs in self-defense. He simply waited, because he could wait better than anyone. While he waited, Napoleon continued dismantling Europe with the efficiency of a courier service. Prussia, 2 weeks. The Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. Alexander meets Bonaparte on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, shakes his hand, and agrees to almost everything. Spain, occupied. Austria, defeated again. By 1810, more than half of Europe was under French control, directly or indirectly. It was the apex, and at the apex, Napoleon began planning Russia. The logic was simple. Russia was not properly enforcing the continental blockade against Britain, meaning it continued to trade with the British in defiance of agreements. Pressure was required. An army of 450,000, a swift campaign, the defeat of the Russians in 1 or 2 large battles, a peace treaty on French terms, the familiar pattern. Napoleon was convinced Russia was merely a larger version of Austria. That was his fundamental mistake, but its consequences were still 2 moves away. Move 1, the Turkish front, often overlooked. While Napoleon prepared his invasion, Russia was entangled in a war with the Ottoman Empire that had dragged on since 1806. Fighting on 2 fronts is a disaster. The southern front had to be closed urgently. Alexander, grinding his teeth, remembered Kutuzov and appointed him commander of the Moldavian army in the spring of 1811. Kutuzov arrived, took stock of the situation, and executed an operation that is still dissected in military academies. He had 46,000 men against 60,000 Ottomans. He lured the main Turkish army onto the left bank of the Danube, feigned a retreat, secretly ferried a corps across to the right bank, and cut off the Turks' line of withdrawal. 35,000 Ottoman soldiers found themselves trapped without food or ammunition. The Ottoman commander, Ahmed Pasha, slipped away under cover of night, abandoning his own army, an act that, in professional circles, is regarded as, at best, unbecoming. The peace treaty was signed on May 16, 1812, exactly 1 month before Napoleon's invasion. The timing was so precise it seemed deliberate. The southern front was closed. The army was freed. Kutuzov was made a count, briefly, because the main performance was only just beginning. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon led 450,000 men across the border river Niemen. In Russian, it was called an invasion. In French, a liberating campaign. In reality, it was the largest military gamble of the era. The army was multinational. French, Poles, Germans, Italians, Austrians, Croats, Portuguese. Virtually the entire continent marched for Napoleon, or at least pretended to. Against this machine, Russia had 3 armies scattered across vast distances, with imperfect supply lines and a high command that was not entirely certain what to do. The Russian commander, Barclay de Tolly, a Scot by origin, a general by profession, made the only rational decision: retreat. Not out of cowardice, but arithmetic. 450,000 against 200,000 dispersed forces is not a battle. It is self-elimination. The French had to be drawn deeper, forced to stretch their supply lines, worn down by endless marches across Russian space. Strategically sound, politically disastrous. Barclay was culturally German. In Russia in 1812, a German in command overseeing a retreat was an explosive combination. Rumors spread instantly. Treason, betrayal. The Germans were surrendering the country on purpose. Officers submitted reports filled with accusations. The nobility pressured the Tsar. The church hinted darkly. Alexander I buckled under the strain and convened a committee to select a new commander. The committee voted for Kutuzov. Alexander signed the appointment with the expression of a man forced to swallow something unpleasant. He reportedly remarked, in effect, "Society chose him. Let society have him." 7 years after Austerlitz, the Tsar's personal resentment toward Kutuzov had not faded. Both men knew what had really happened at Austerlitz. Both pretended they did not. Kutuzov assumed command on August 17th, 1812. The army saw a 70-year-old heavy-set man with an eye patch, mounting his horse with difficulty, dozing during briefings. Young, dashing officers drew their own conclusions. But when he spoke, and he spoke rarely, it became clear he knew something the others did not. Every generation has a few such people. Kutuzov was one of them. Borodino, September 7th, 1812. A village roughly 100 miles west of Moscow. Here, an uncomfortable truth must be stated. One Russian historiography took time to digest. Borodino was not a victory. It was a bloody stalemate with catastrophic losses on both sides. The Russians lost about 44,000 killed and wounded. The French around 35,000. The Russian army withdrew afterward. Napoleon held the field. By standard military criteria, Siberia, it was a French victory. Kutuzov wrote to Alexander I that he had won the battle. It was untrue, but it was a necessary untruth. At moments of crisis, a nation requires not precise statistics, but a reason to endure. The real outcome of Borodino lay elsewhere. The Russian army was not destroyed. It retreated, but remained intact. Napoleon had not achieved what he wanted: total annihilation and capitulation. He occupied the field, but did not crush his opponent. That distinction between holding ground and destroying an army would prove decisive weeks later. Now, the pivotal moment: the village of Fili, September 1st, 1812. A small wooden hut on the western edge of Moscow. At the table, Kutuzov and 13 generals. The question: defend Moscow or abandon it without a fight. The defensive position was untenable. Everyone admitted as much. If they fought and lost, the army would be destroyed. If the army were destroyed, the war would be over. If Moscow were surrendered but the army preserved, the war would continue. The arithmetic was simple. But Moscow was not just a city. It was the ancient capital, the symbol, the heart of Russia in the consciousness of the time. To abandon it was politically akin to publicly declaring defeat. The generals argued loudly. Bennigsen demanded battle. Most others leaned the same way. Another retreat felt unbearable. Kutuzov listened. For a long time. Then he said, paraphrased, as no verbatim transcript survives, "With the loss of Moscow, Russia is not lost. With the loss of the army, all is lost." And he ordered a retreat. It was one of the boldest decisions in military history, not because it required physical courage, but because it required the willingness to accept blame, immediate, loud, and lasting, which is exactly what followed. Moscow burned for 3 days. Governor Rostopchin personally ordered warehouses set alight and issued proclamations suggesting something close to betrayal. Citizens fled in waves. Officers writing home called Kutuzov a coward, and worse. Alexander I received reports and responded with an icy silence more eloquent than words. All of Russia looked at the old man with the eye patch and thought uncharitable thoughts. Meanwhile, Kutuzov executed the maneuver that would enter the textbooks. He led the army through Moscow, marched southeast along the Ryazan road. French reconnaissance followed. Then, in a single night, wheeled sharply southwest and established camp near the village of Tarutino. The French lost sight of him for days. It was extraordinary. A 90,000-strong army had simply vanished from Napoleon's reconnaissance. The Tarutino position was no accident. Kutuzov placed himself between Napoleon and the southern provinces of Russia, where food, forage, reserves, and the Tula arms factory were located. The situation now looked different. Napoleon sat in a burning Moscow. To the south, Kutuzov blocked the way. To the west lay hundreds of miles of devastated territory. Winter approached. Supply collapsed. Napoleon remained in Moscow for 35 days, waiting for peace negotiations. None came. He sent a letter to Alexander I via Kutuzov through General Lauriston. Kutuzov simulated negotiations with consummate skill. He met, nodded, promised to forward messages, bought time. Alexander did not reply at all. Napoleon struggled to comprehend this logic. In his world, wars ended in treaties. The victor dictated terms. The defeated agreed. Everyone departed. Russia refused to play by those rules. It was something fundamentally new. On October 7th, 1812, Napoleon began his retreat. What left Moscow could scarcely be called the Grande Armée. 95,000 men instead of 450,000. The rest had remained along the road from the Niemen to Moscow, in graves, as deserters, or in hospital registers. Kutuzov blocked the southern route at the town of Maloyaroslavets. The battle raged all day. The town changed hands 8 times. Strategically, the French lost. They were forced to turn back onto the devastated Smolensk road, the same road by which they had come, and where nothing remained. What followed was no longer a military campaign. It was collapse. The frosts did come, yes, but the army was disintegrating long before the cold set in. There was no food, no forage for the horses. Discipline evaporated. Soldiers stopped obeying officers. Kutuzov marched parallel to the retreating French, in no hurry to force a decisive battle. Why would he? Cossacks tore French columns apart. Peasant partisan bands, something Napoleon had not anticipated at all, attacked supply trains and isolated units. Denis Davidov and his hussars appeared where least expected, took prisoners, and vanished. The French army was dying. Kutuzov simply walked beside it and watched. At the crossing of the Berezina River in November 1812, the remnants of the Grande Armée lost tens of thousands more. On December 5th, Napoleon abandoned his army and left for Paris in a sleigh, traveling incognito to regain political control before news of the catastrophe reached the capital. In January 1813, the pitiful remains of what 5 months earlier had been an invincible force crossed back over the Nemean. Fewer than 100,000 effective troops out of 450,000. This was not a defeat. It was liquidation. And here comes the turn rarely emphasized in celebratory narratives. Kutuzov opposed continuing the war beyond Russia's borders. When the army crossed the Niemen and Alexander I began speaking of a European campaign, Mikhail Illarionovich expressed himself in roughly these terms: "We have saved Russia. Why now die for Prussian and Austrian interests?" This was not cowardice or pacifism. It was cold calculation. The army was exhausted exhausted, supply systems strained, the treasury depleted, casualties immense. Another campaign meant more blood, more expense. For what? So that the same Prussians and Austrians, who only months earlier had marched in Napoleon's ranks against Russia, might be liberated at Russian expense? Alexander did not listen. Again, the war continued. Kutuzov went. He was a soldier. What choice did he have? And died in April 1813 in the Silesian town of Bunzlau. Pneumonia. 67 years old. 3 bullets through his head over the course of his career. Endless campaigns. The Polish winter. Not heroically. Not in battle. He simply lay down and did not rise, which for a man of his biography sounds almost like rest. His body was brought to St. Petersburg. He was buried in Kazan Cathedral. Alexander I wept at the funeral. Sincerely, perhaps. Although the words "I was wrong" were never spoken aloud. Now the financial chapter often skipped in patriotic accounts. The War of 1812 devastated Russia's economy. The national debt grew roughly 7-fold, from 100 million rubles to 700 million. The ruble depreciated. The Smolensk and Moscow provinces lay in ruins for years. Nobles who had burned or lost their estates during the retreat demanded compensation the treasury could not provide. Victory? Absolute and historic. The cost? Enormous. And paid for decades. Kutuzov was hated for surrendering Moscow. Later, when the outcome became clear, he was made a national hero. Streets were renamed, monuments erected. In 1837, 24 years after his death, a bronze Kutuzov was placed before Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg, where he lies. Nicholas I ordered it. Mikhail Illarionovich himself never asked for such things and, judging by his character, would likely have found it faintly amusing. What actually happened was this. An elderly professional soldier, one-eyed and overweight, outplayed the finest commander of his age, not in a brilliant duel of tactics, but in patience. He understood what Napoleon never did. Russia was not a country to be defeated in a handful of battles. It was a space that consumed armies. The objective was not to win a battle. The objective was not to lose the war. Those are different things, and very few generals can tell the difference. Napoleon would die in 1821 on the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic, exiled in damp air, slowly and without much ceremony. Alexander I would die in 1825 under circumstances strange enough to give rise to a legend that he had staged his own death and wandered off as a monk, a legend that still persists. Kutuzov died before both of them, on a road he considered unnecessary, in a town he had never seen before. Moscow he surrendered still stands. The Russia he saved still exists. Sometimes that is enough to determine who was right in the end.